We have a quorum now, so Madam Clerk, if you could, please call the roll.
This is good.
Alderman Kennedy. Alderman Boyd.
Present.
Alderwoman Davis.
Present.
Alderman Kotar.
Here.
Alderman Ogilvy.
Here.
Alderwoman Boyd. Here. Alderman Bosley.
Here.
Alderman Oldenburg.
Present.
Chairman Rhodey.
Present.
President Reed. 8 present.
Wow, good turnout today. Thanks everyone for your attendance on this important issue. I'd like to make a couple introductory remarks, and then I'm going to kick off the presentation, but then I'll come back and because we got, as usual, we're trying to run around and do all this stuff at the last minute, and we're not ready to. If there's any left over.
I think we'll have some.
Yeah, we should have some left over for the audience.
Yeah.
So we need 1, 2, 3 of these down this direction. We need 1, 2, 3, 4 in that direction. Pass those down.
Okay.
We'll have extra maps and some resolutions up there. If Madam Clerk put them out here. To try to share with people the process that we're going to go through, I wanted to go ahead and have the initial hearing today on the resolution. The resolution we threw in last week was more or less a placeholder. We've revised it to make it more logically consistent with what we had done last session, which was Resolution 33 as amended. So we've done that. We anticipate some additional changes, but we wanted to go ahead and have this hearing today. The initial plan is that come back, I think, is it Monday or Tuesday next week, Dale, that we have? Right, but we're going to try to provide neighborhood development the opportunity to hear the resolution. Wasn't that the original plan?
Oh, neighborhood development is one that you're right.
Okay. So the intent is to provide neighborhood development an opportunity to have some input, and then we will formally go ahead and probably put a committee substitute before us next Wednesday. So today, this is probably going to be 95% of the committee substitute that we passed out. It's draft form, so we're going to be talking about it, even though it's not necessarily before us. I think we had to have it before us 24 hours ahead of time, and it still had not been to the point where SLDC felt comfortable with it. So, and then we come back next Wednesday, and hopefully we'll formally adopt it at committee next Wednesday. We have been holding some board bills and some resolutions until we got this passed, and so the goal would be next Wednesday that we take those up. Those have been advertised for. If for whatever reason we're not there yet, we can always hold them in committee, but they have been advertised. So we're, yeah, I think it's only appropriate that we at least hear them to meet that publication requirement. Now, so that's going to be kind of the outline. I guess I'll stand up now and kind of go through a bit of a presentation that I prepared, and I'll turn it back over to Otis, and I'll come back and take the chair. If I could do that real quick. And for those of you who've been down here for a while and have dealt with it, forgive me if this is a little bit redundant today. I'm trying to slow down and bring everybody up to speed on some of the newer members so that we're all on the same page. The reason I got involved in all this is I wanted to go ahead and make sure that we had one economic development plan for the whole city, or one process. What was going on for many years down here is that each alderman had their own view of how to do things, and so depending on which ward you approached, you might end up with a completely different approach to doing economic development or how to use incentives and so forth. So obviously, when you get 28 people trying to share a vision and kind of get them all on the same page, it's going to take some time. I took over the chairmanship about 4.5 years ago in February of 2014. I spent about a year trying to understand, and I spent a year of my free time going back through budgets and what was going on over at SLDC, and then made a presentation to the committee about a year ago, about a year after I had taken over as chair, so that would have been back in May of 2015, and kind of said, you know, we really need to do this, and the staff over at SLDC has been great to work with. It is a very, very complicated process, and when I deal with these incentives, I could I could argue either side of an argument. Both sides frequently have validity, but if we go ahead and use our incentives and do it in such a way that it's consistent with a overall business plan for the city, it then starts making a lot more sense. And so we are now at the point where we've got an RFP out for a business plan, so we're doing that. We've done a lot of the incentives. We've done a lot of analysis work on this incentive stuff. My hope is that we can pass this resolution here next week and put this aside for a year or so until we have the business plan done. There's other things that our committee needs to deal with. I talked to you last time. If we can put this aside, maybe we can take a look at affordable housing and some of these other issues, and just like we've done on incentives over the last year, really get a much better understanding of them. So what I wanted to do was have one plan for the city. I think it's been very, very important for us to have a predictable outcome for a developer. A developer comes in here with a large plan, spends lots of money and time, and then at the end of the process comes before the Board of Aldermen and he doesn't know if he's going to get the incentive package or not. So we need to go ahead and make that predictable, and we can't have this free-for-all down here every time we do that. So that's kind of what I've been trying to work towards, and I want to thank all of you. I've been probably one of the larger beneficiaries of projects that have received incentives. I know that I've had, as a result of all the controversy around this, I've had a lot of people calling me up and complaining, and yet my ward's benefited a great deal from them. Some of you have probably gotten the same complaints but have not had the same benefit, yet you've consistently supported our projects, and whether they're mine or other places throughout the city. And I want to thank you for doing that and trusting myself and the folks over at SLDC for doing this. It's really appreciate the confidence and the trust you've placed in us in doing this, and we have really tried to work hard to come up with a project and a process that is fair for the whole city and is good for the city. So with that, let me kind of walk through, and if you could go ahead, next one. Okay. I always like to start at the beginning, and the beginning for us is our vision statement. This is what the rules say. We've talked about this before in one of our committees. This is what our rules say our committee should be doing. If you flip to the next slide, this is my interpretation, hopefully our interpretation. We're going to facilitate urban development to maintain the economic viability of our city, improve the economic well-being of our residents as measured by, and the alderman from the 16th Ward has been working on developing some of these performance measures. And we're going to, right now they've been economic for the city. We're going to go ahead and start taking a look at the well-being of our residents. We had a Federal Reserve, and hopefully at some point we'll get to the point where we'll actually have an annual report that will be updated that can show us either the progress or the lack of progress that we're making. And then how we're going to do that, if you can flip the next slide then for me, Lisa. To achieve this, we're going to use planning and zoning to optimize our development opportunities that can be derived from our unique transportation, location, institution, community attributes, and competitive advantages. That's an area that we're going to need to spend some time on. It looks like we're going to actually have some additional money for planning this next year. We need to start having conversations with the planning department and have them come in before us. So that's ahead of us. That's why we can't spend all of our time on this incentive stuff. We've spent the last several years on it. Now, the next one is use federal, state, local, and economic incentives and programs to adjust the inefficiencies and weaknesses in our tax-to-service model. That's what the whole incentive discussion is. That's what we spent the last couple years on. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that in just a couple minutes. The last one, allocate community development block grant funds, and this is directly from the CDBG website, ensure decent affordable housing to provide services to the most vulnerable in our communities and to create jobs through expansion and retention of business. We passed the block grant application, one of the largest sources of money that we have in the city. That is what the mission of the block grant is per their website. So those are kind of our three things. Now, let's get back to the tax to service thing. So this is the whole incentive discussion, and it's all designed to adjust the tax to service ratio. So everybody has a different, there's a whole area of study about taxes and how to tax, what's the fair way to tax. And we can discuss that, but none of them are really perfect taxes in that they allocate the cost to the people who use the services. We can tax by the square foot, we can tax by the value of the property, we can tax by consumption, we can tax by your earnings. They're all strategies, but none of them are very efficient. What tax incentives do is they adjust those to create a competitive price that you can go ahead and offer to the market. Now, what I'm going to go through here, since we have some younger members of the board, I'm going to try to do a little analogy and use beer as our example because I thought it might get Alderman Bosley and Oldenburg's attention if we talked about beer. So think about if you go to the ballpark and they charge $9 for a beer. And why can they do that? It's because they have a monopoly. If you want to buy a beer in the ballpark, they're the only ones selling it. That was kind of like the city of St. Louis all the way up until, 1876. So, we had the entire riverfront, 64 miles, and if you think about the difference between then and now, if your business was located down on the river, you'd only be at most a mile or two away. You'd probably take a horse down to work every day if you didn't just walk. All the value and the wealth that was created in the region at that time was along the river. 1876, we draw the dividing line. We think we got everything's in the bag. We got all the goodie stuff located in the city. Well, times change. You get an airport, and suddenly people can do transportation by airports. You have highways and railroads, and you can get down to if you own something in the city, you can get down there by a highway or a car, and you don't need to live nearby. So all of a sudden we have the suburbs, and we're no longer the only game in town. And all of the suburbs are competing to go ahead and pay the taxes that they're paying. And they all have different strategies. So back in the early days when we were the monopoly, we could charge any taxes any which way we want. We were selling $9 beers. And we could go ahead, and if we wanted to go ahead and throw an earnings tax on, nobody cared. If we wanted to increase their real estate taxes, they had no choice. But when cars came in, airports moved, no longer all the value in the region is along the riverfront, we're not the only game in town. And so we now have competition, and each one of those suburbs are then adjusting their tax to service ratio. And go ahead and flip the next slide for me, Lisa. So we're sitting here trying to sell $9 beers, and we're no longer the only game in town. And you can go ahead, and if you start thinking about it, if suddenly other people can sell beer in the stadium instead of just the owners of the sports team, you're going to see all kinds of competition develop. You might end up having group discounts. So if a whole bunch of people show up to the ball game, they'll go ahead and they'll give you a little bit of discount. All the leverage in the municipal area is now in big taxpayers. So if you are a big retailer, you can go ahead and play one municipality off against the other municipality. If you're like us and you're located on a river, you can play the state of Illinois off against the state of Missouri as the NGA did. So the other things you have is you can have businesses and shopping centers, so you have businesses being chased after, and people are discounting the taxes they charge businesses to locate them. They're giving discounts to shopping centers to have the shopping centers located in their municipalities. And what about the premium seats? What if you go ahead and anybody been down to the green seats where you pay a couple $100 and you get all the food and beer you want by paying that $250? Well, that's kind of like Ladue. Ladue, when they created their municipality, their strategy was to go ahead and only let people who live in 1 acre lots live out there. And so if you live in 1 acre lots, you're probably going to be pretty wealthy, and you're going to be able to go ahead and have relatively low tax rates because you're only wealthy people living there. You may recall several months ago when we were in here and we were talking about the difference between tax rate and tax base. Well, if you have a very large tax base, you can keep a very low tax rate. And so that's what's going on in areas like that. One thing other people have discounts for who've never been to a game. So our state and federal government created all kinds of advantages for people buying new homes in the suburbs by building roads for them and highways and making it very cheap for them to go ahead and locate out there. So all these discounts were going on out there, and we couldn't take advantage of a lot of those in the city. And of course, none of them, though, were going out there and saying, oh, we'd like to go ahead and recruit the poor people from the city to come out and live in our municipality. Nobody was interested in doing that. And as a result, the city has ended up with a disproportionate share of the region's poor. I passed out a couple articles. One of them is up there. It shows you that the city of St. Louis has about 20% of the region's poor. It should be in front of you. Not of the region's poor, but 20% of our population is below the poverty level. That's twice the rate in St. Louis County and 4 times the rate out in St. Charles County. So nobody was going ahead and saying, oh, let's go ahead and figure out a way to attract low-income people to our municipality, and it's because it's very, very expensive to provide services for low-income people. Now, what TIFs and tax abatements do is they give us the ability to adjust our price so that we can attract certain segments of the market that we know are to be profitable. And so that's why we've gone through this entire process. Lisa, why don't you go ahead and flip to the next slide. Now, the easy way to fix this, which should probably be done at the state level, is only let the stadium adjust price of the beer. In other words, right now, we have this process up at the state that says you declare something blighted. Well, they blight almost everything. But they're going ahead and permitting very wealthy municipalities to blight property and provide these incentives that further economically segregate the Claytons and the town and countries and so forth. And, what the state should do is say, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to provide some housing for lower income people, or you can't even do it at all unless a certain percentage of your population is lower income, because it shouldn't be about the blighting of the property. It should be about the poverty level within the municipality that is wanting to do the incentive program. The other alternative would be to let the stadium collude. In other words, if you're selling beer in the stadium, you go ahead and collude with everybody else so you can keep your prices up. I passed out another article. That's happening in St. Louis County. If you read that, you'll see that, and they're fighting about it, of course, but if you're in St. Louis County and you do a big retail development, part of that sales tax is shared throughout the county. The city's not part of the county, so we can't go ahead and participate in that. So when we lose 1 out of every 3 retail dollars to the suburbs, we get none of that back. But if you live in Ladue and you go out to Chesterfield to shop, some of that retail dollars comes back to you. So that's the reason, if we were to join St. Louis County and we had some revenue sharing with them, then we could have some of that money and begin addressing some of the very critical social needs and social justice needs of the city. But so many of the folks that are complaining about TIF and tax abatement, they're complaining about it in the city. And we're doing our share, for the region's lower income residents. I mean, you can't transfer wealth unless you have it. And so many of our incentive programs are designed to bring wealth back to the city, whether it's in the form of businesses or higher income residents, and then be able to transfer that wealth to people who need it. And many of the folks at Team TIF and places like that have been critical of what we're doing, but they haven't offered a really valid solution. So we're going to go ahead and try to address some of the things that we can, but there's really limits to what we can do. Why don't you go ahead and flip the next slide, Lisa? So our goals, you know, in addition to having one plan for the city and giving our developers outcome, is the first thing we wanted to do when we developed the economic model that Jonathan's been working on, and I mean, we've been very, very fortunate. Jonathan's a bright guy, has put his heart and soul in this thing for the last couple of years, is if we're going to go ahead and give these discounts, we want to make sure that we're still going to be able to make money on them. So, you know, if we're going to go ahead and give a discount to a large business or to an apartment complex or something like that, we want to make sure that the city still makes money if we're going to discount it. The next thing is we want to make sure that we get people to buy beer and buy our beer. So how do we get them, if we're going to be making money on this stuff, how do we get them in the city? So some of our projects that we're providing this incentives for, they're in the central corridor. But if they weren't in the central corridor, they wouldn't be in the city at all. And I use something like IKEA. You know, IKEA, there's only one of those in the region, and if it wasn't going to get done in the city, it was going to be out in Fenton. The building 100 up on Kings Highway, if that wasn't built, you know, they weren't going to build that on Crondelet Park or Fairgrounds Park. There's only a couple places in the city that are going to end up doing a large-scale high-rise like that. So if we're going to get big developments like that, we'd rather than just give up and let them have it in the county, we'd like to get them in the city. The next thing is how do we go ahead and not sell $3 beers to people willing to pay $9? And that's what we're going to try to do with this map here. The map, we're sitting there, and if we're thinking that in the dark green areas, those are areas that people, if they move into them, should be willing to pay $9, and the lighter color areas should be areas that people might not pay $9, but we'll charge them $3. In other words, we're going to give them a little bit more tax abatement. Now, this is the map. The model does something similar to that, but it's not as visible. It's more complicated, but the idea is that with the model, you're going to end up having, it's going to be easier, and you'll get more incentive, you'll get your hurdles and everything will be easier in neighborhoods that typically have lower economic activity going on them. And in neighborhoods that have higher economic activity, it's going to go ahead and force those projects to be bigger projects and more profitable than they otherwise would be. So, and the last thing is you know, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we go ahead and make this so that it's spread throughout the whole city. So how can we make sure that we're selling beer in every neighborhood? This is just going to be one component of this, but what we're trying to do is create a difference so that the projects, you know, in the strongest neighborhoods get less incentives, projects in weaker neighborhoods get more incentives, but this is only going to be one piece of the puzzle. This by itself is not going to spread development throughout the city. Otis is doing a number of other things to try to help that. One of those things is planning. Another thing is the redeployment of our commercial district managers so that they go ahead and begin doing other things. So this, I wanted to provide this background or introduction because I feel very strongly about it, and I really appreciate the fact that many of you have taken, you know, some criticism for supporting some of the projects in the Central Corridor. I want to tell you I appreciate your continued support on it, and we have worked really hard. Otis and his staff, I think, have been great and very responsive. Could you go ahead and flip the next slide? I think that might be it for me, yeah. So why don't you, at this point, I think Otis wanted to say a few things, and I'm going to go ahead and sit down then.
Good morning, everyone. We're here to talk again about one of our favorite topics, and that is incentive and incentive reform. I'm going to talk about one slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to I call them my smart guys, and they're going to talk through this, and we can then answer your questions. But I want to put it in context. Can you go to the next slide for me? And just let me say that we had a huge conversation about incentives and whether or not we could, in fact, do a map that would take in consideration everything that we incentivize. And we came to a conclusion after looking at it that we could really do this best for properties, residential properties under $1 million. And so the map that you have essentially says recommended abatement for residential projects under $1 million. We will continue to look at commercial projects on a case-by-case basis and and that will brief what we're doing as far as that, okay? And try and make it make what we provide you a better mousetrap, if you will, so that you can clearly understand what the benefit is to the city. And the Alderman mentioned, we need to get value from this, so we're looking at the return on investment, if you will, for both the city and for the developer. We realize that a developer will not invest unless they're able to get a reasonable return. But we also want to make sure that the city get a reasonable return as well. And so let me go to the next slide, please. And so there's a lot of talk about who did what first. So all I'm going to say is that we have been talking about incentive reform for a while. We actually commissioned a study that was published in 2015. We obviously had to be thinking about it before that in order to get the consultant on board, and we went through the review for almost a year. So we have been at this for a while. From that came a number of recommendations, and I wanted to just highlight on this slide the things these were 3 significant recommendations that I think is going to benefit the city in the long run. The first one was to establish a framework for reporting and analyzing incentive data. And as you know, we have we then immediately went to hire Jonathan, and now we also have Matt on board, so that we can take a look, and we essentially, Jonathan, through his own initiative, built a model working with a lot of academic folk, working with folks who are in the industry, built a model that now people look at from around the nation, actually, to try and figure out how we've done it and what we're doing. It is if you just look at the model, it is difficult. It is not for the average person to look at, which is why we want to make the output something that people could look at and understand. And so you'll get a chance to see what that is. And so what we wanted to do was to do more quantitative analysis, and so we were accused early on of not doing that. While we were reviewing in the early days, good and bad, we didn't have a basis for being able to report it the way we do now. And so we have the quantitative model, and we have the ability to look at the return on investment for both of us, the developer and for the city. The second one require additional reporting from recipients. And so we are building a platform where if in fact will happen, real-time feedback from the developer, where they will feed information into our system, and we will have that to be able to roll up and be able to tell you at a moment's notice what the benefit has been. What we're trying to do is to build something that is transparent, so that for every project that we pass, we can then at some point be able to you click it and you can see what the benefit to date is for a certain project. It may not be to date. It could be for the last year of what was that benefit. But that is what we're working on to try and do that. We're requiring and adding requirements to developers as they get the benefits to things that we want them to report back to us, so that we can then provide more analysis on what the benefit has been. The last one here is to focus the incentive use around a citywide plan for development. We are in the midst of selecting the consultant that will lead the effort to have an economic development strategy. We're in an interview process. We have done 3. We have 3 more to go this month, next week. And at some point within the next 30 days, we'll be making you aware of the selected firm. We're using the city's established process where we have representatives from the president's office, from the mayor's office, and from the comptroller's office, along with 2 representatives from St. Louis Development. And we also have the planning director as a senior advisor to our process. He's sitting in on all of our interviews and discussions, along with both Matt and John. So we are moving ahead, and I just want to make sure that the the committee is aware of the number of initiatives out there. These are just as a result of the PFM study, but we have a lot of other things that we are doing, and so we'll be able to share. So I'm going to turn this over to Matt Bauer, who is one of our financial analysts, and who's going to lead you through the rest of the presentation.
Hi, happy to speak with you all today. So I think one of our big discussions has been looking at the advantages and disadvantages of the 2 processes we've been talking about mainly, meaning a map for abatement and utilizing the model for abatement. So I'm going to quickly go through the kind of pluses and minuses of both and how we're looking at it. So one of the reasons we use a model and look to a model is it provides a consistent framework for collecting development data. As Otis mentioned in the past, there wasn't a good, although we looked at the incentives, there wasn't a good collection methodology so that we could have history and go back and analyze what we've been doing with our incentives. So by having a model, we have a framework to do that going forward. We're collecting data on every development project over $1 million and can put that in a database that eventually we can do some reporting and tracking on. The other reason is we've got a wide variety of projects in the city from a multitude of developers, and every developer has their own model. And if we didn't put them into a consistent format, there would be no way to do that analysis to compare projects to one another, because it would be all in widely different formats. So by funneling all those different development models into a single city development model, we can have consistent data to do some of the things that we want to do with it. It also provides a quantitative analysis of these development proposals. With a map or just a very simple model, we wouldn't be able to determine what the benefits are for the city. The model as it is gives us the ability to see what benefits the city is getting from it. It also allows us to estimate the benefits to the developer, the but-for test. Is the developer getting a fair and reasonable return, or are they getting an above excess return that they really don't need to make the project happen with the incentives? So we're able to balance that benefit to the developer and the city, so that we're trying to make the price right. So it also, by the way the model is structured, it's going to incentivize projects that are more dense than what's existing in the neighborhood surrounding it. And there are several reasons. One, it's the more efficient use of our land to generate tax dollars, but also denser projects also are more efficient uses of the tax dollars we have of our services, police, fire, trash. We do acknowledge that there's things that we can improve on the existing model, and it's things that John and I and others at SLW are working on, and we'll highlight some of those at the end. But basically providing a better, easier explanation for what the model is doing, providing more readable and accessible model for the developers. Initially, it was kind of confusing to developers, so we've worked on that to make it easier for developers to input their numbers directly, so there's no loss of interpretation between what they put in and what we're analyzing. We're going to use more relatable outputs, and we'll show some of that later too, just to show what the benefits are for the city and how the developer is benefiting. And also, we're doing these things, and we've had the meetings previously, but trying to do more outreach to aldermen, developers, and the general public too. Public interest groups as well we've spoken with. So. And then on the other hand, why would we want a map? We're going to limit this map to residential projects under $1 million at this point, and we'll talk a little bit about why. And I think first and most importantly, it's easier, a visual map is easier to understand than a multi-page Excel model. So a lot of our projects, and we estimate about 80% are these smaller, this would cover about 80% of our projects. And these are done by smaller developers, rehabbers, and sometimes do-it-yourselfers who don't really have the capacity or the time to enter data into a large model, whereas a larger development company would. It also provides you and the public some guidelines and expectations on what they can anticipate for the abatement they might receive for these smaller projects. And then developers can look at the map and target locations where that incentive is. But there are some limitations to the map. So as I said with the model, it doesn't capture the data on all these developments. There's no, if we rule by the map, we're not getting data to input and to track. It doesn't determine the benefit to the city. So that's something that the model provides us. And for commercial and mixed-use projects, commercial data is not readily available, so it's difficult to map. We just don't have the capacity and the data to do that. And then there's some kind of softer limitations, and that's, we all have our preconceptions of what a map should look like, where incentives should be given and where it shouldn't. But to get, and then that provides us with another problem that's coming to a consensus, is that it's very, very, very difficult, even among John and I, to agree on what census block group should get this incentive and what should get another census. So we have to come to a happy medium where most people are happy with most of the map, and then acknowledge that going forward. And then there's always going to be some exceptions, and some examples might be historic properties or existing properties that the community values. Historic tax credits are more difficult to get these days, so we might have to fill that gap with incentive in an area that typically would not have incentive. Or affordable housing if we put affordable housing in a green area of the map, I think that's a great goal for us. It's difficult to accomplish a lot of times, and those projects should get incentive for locating in those areas. And so just some examples of these issues that we're dealing with as we look at the preconceptions, the consensus, and exceptions and we don't have all the answers, but just these are some of the things we juggled as we went through this process. And so if we look at a long vacant house on a block that's otherwise well established, it might be in the green area, but it's the last block. So, it's the last house and it's been vacant for 20 years. Does that deserve incentive or not? And there's differing opinions on that. Single family, a lot of things we see coming through SLD are single family home expansions on the hill, where homes sell very fast, even in some of the downtime. So does that need incentive? Even though home values on the hill in some cases are below average, and we have a lot of older, smaller homes, and low-income seniors a lot of times on fixed incomes. And then we've got projects going in the Grove where there's some blocks that are still need help, but on the next block over, we've got $500,000 homes. And then we've got homes I've seen in Cherokee, like on the same block across the street from each other, that are selling for the same price and in the same amount of time, and one developer is using incentives and one is not, even though the income and home values in that larger area would lend itself to incentives. So how do we deal with that? Already talked about the historic tax credits and the affordable housing, so. So I think some important things to say is we've tried, but there is no perfect map. There's data that's very good, but it's not perfect. And it can't fully capture what's going on the ground at the very moment. And as we said, everybody has preconceived notions. In trying to do, John will talk a little bit about the process, the more detailed process we went through to come up with the map. But we target some specific census blocks where we had these preconceived notions. And if you try to fix the neighborhood that's definitely needs incentive, that somehow turned up green, then you create another problem somewhere else. So we're trying to, it was a whole balancing act of trying to get that. So we know it's not perfect, and we'll talk about some ways that we might deal with that. But I think part of that is just acknowledging that we think probably 90% of the city is pretty good here, but there's going to be those outliers that it were problems that we couldn't fix. So also we want to talk about the on-the-ground at the moment stuff. I think some of the other things that we'll consider in addition to the map going forward too is looking at sales data and sales comps as we're talking about specific projects. And also we do have a simple for sale model that we look at and give a little bit of consideration to. So we're not just looking at the map. The map is providing us a strong guideline, but we're looking at other factors that are going on. Go ahead. One of those processes that came out of our discussions with you through the process was implementing an abatement cap to mitigate some of the issues where we have a census block group that suggests a very high level of abatement, but maybe there's projects that are very high value that probably shouldn't justify that abatement. So the idea is to cap abatement to a certain level. Here we've talked about 250,000, but we're open to your input going forward on what exactly a cap should be. And I try to illustrate these here. But it also supports improvements of neighborhoods without, quote, gentrifying a neighborhood by adding home values that might leapfrog what we'd otherwise expect. So the first bar graph is we're just assuming a $50,000 acquisition and a $350,000 improvement. So the first bar is no abatement. We're taxing, everything is taxed. The second bar is what might typically be done. Let's say it's in an area that says 90% abatement for 10 years. So we're abating the improved value, and that bar represents, the top dotted bar represents 90% of the value, or $315,000 of the abated value. The third bar graph shows one idea of the cap, and that's we're going to cap the abated value at $250,000. So only $250,000 of the improvement can be abated. Anything above that will be taxed at a normal rate. And when you plug the numbers in, that essentially turns out to be a 71% abatement. And then the other potential is to limit the total amount of value. So we would then include the acquisition too. So in this case, the abatement is only 57%. And there's some detailed plus and minuses of those two scenarios that I'm not going to get into today, but we can have that discussion going forward. So that should kind of level out some of the peaks and valleys or mainly the peaks that we're seeing in here, where if somebody wanted to build a $500,000 house in a red area, we want that investment, but we don't want to over-incentivize that luxury house. Okay, Good. And now I'll turn it over to John to talk kind of about the kind of the ins and outs of us making the map and what the map is actually showing.
First of all, good morning. Good to see you all. It's been a couple of months, so nice to see your faces. So you guys get the lucky pleasure of getting to hear me talk about the sort of the wonky side of the map and how it came about. So I'm going to try and err on the side of being less wonky, and if you guys have any specific questions, then you guys can ask me afterwards or here, whatever. All right, so first of all, we developed the map as opposed to using an existing map like the MVA map because A, the MVA is outdated, the data from it is from 2012, and so we were able to basically use our own data that's, you know, A, the MVA is proprietary, which means we don't have access to any of the models or any of the things that go into actually telling us what makes the zone what it is. So that's part of the reason. And then again, we get to sort of like look at what the data is used and sort of pick the variables that we think make the most sense sort of on a theoretical basis. And then we can update it regularly at no cost. Again, MVA is proprietary. If you want to update it as is being done currently, you have to pay a company to do it, and it's not very cheap. As far as you know, collecting input, obviously we met with several of you over this process. About 18 of the aldermen showed up. We met with the home builders and some public interest groups, and also consulted with other SLDC staff throughout the building. We identified some key census block groups as sort of as test areas to kind of figure out like these areas that are sort of like on the line, if you will, that kind of like you know, like the Grove, the ones that are in transition, the ones that we had to kind of see, does that make sense? They're sort of our test cases. And then, you know, we updated the map. The map that you guys have in front of you is sort of the third major iteration of the map. The one that you guys saw in the aldermanic meetings was the first iteration, and the one that was at the open house was the second iteration, and there have been like minor tweaks for each iteration. So I don't know, we've probably made like 40 maps at this point. But anyway, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So overall, what we did was we looked at two sort of categories of variables. We looked at variables that more or less measure what is the neighborhood condition at the most recent point in which we have data. And then we looked at data that would give us more an idea of how is the trend moving in a certain area, in a certain neighborhood or a certain block. So we've experimented with a number of different things, but ultimately we ended up weighting it about 2/3, at least in this iteration of the map, we've weighted it 2/3 towards existing condition and 1/3 towards what is the trend or how are things moving. The variables that we've used for neighborhood condition, these are all from the U.S. Census. They come from the American Community Survey. 2016 data is the latest that's available presently. We use median home value, and we were able to get that at the block group level. A block group is basically a grouping of usually about, I don't know, 10 blocks or so, 10 city blocks. And then there's a census tract level, which is probably about 40 city blocks. To give you an idea, there's 360 block groups in the city and 106 census tracts in the city. So anyway, so we use median home value and median home value per room. They don't have per square foot, so per room was sort of a proxy for value per square foot. We use median household income, median rents, and building vacancies. So this is the weighting that we've used currently. It will change in the fourth iteration. Mainly because as we've learned more about the home value numbers, we've discovered that those are self-reported numbers to the census, meaning that they ask people, hey, what do you think your house is worth? And someone's like, yeah, it's worth $2 million. And they don't like check it against home sales or anything. So we're going to actually be replacing some of that with Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. So that's actual data from the banking institutions that say how much they issued mortgages for and how many mortgages and those types of things. So the second group of variables is neighborhood change. So here we've used median home value, again, change. It's the same problem, but the change over time, and then median income. So we're going to, again, probably replace that with change in mortgages issued over time rather than home value changes. We'll probably still include home value in there. We're just going to lower the weighting quite a bit. And then we use total housing permits, which I'll save the wonkiness part, but basically the home values create an internal consistency problem within our index, so we're going to have to, that's why we dialed it down from the second iteration of the map, and we'll probably honestly have to pull that one out altogether because it's still creating some problems. We can go to the next slide. So as far as, I guess, the, if you want to call it the underlying theory of how we decided how much abatement for what areas, we made there's a sense, in essence, a policy decision, and it really requires your input. But we made the decision to say if we could use all these same variables and we could look at the whole St. Louis region, the metropolitan statistical area, which includes, I think, like 15 counties plus the city, 8 counties in Illinois and 7 in Missouri plus the city. What we did was we created this index that said 1 on the index means that that's what the region averages across all these different variables. And so then we said if there's a block group in the city that is less than 1, that means that economically speaking it is weaker than the region. And so therefore we made the policy decision that said if it's weaker than the region, then it's probably eligible for some level of abatement. And then the weaker it was relative to the region, the more abatement we granted it. The levels of abatement that we came up with were more along the lines of where we kind of see breaks at and what we've given in past projects. You know, like the maximum amount generally is 15 years, 10 at 100%, 5 at 50%. So we said, if it's less than half as strong as the region, let's just go ahead and give it all of the maximum amount of abatement that we can. The lowest level of abatement we generally give to any project would be like 5 years at 50%. So we said, if it's between 90% and equal to the region, let's just give it the minimum amount of abatement, which is 5 years at 50%. And then we sort of just picked a series of tiers in between those two ranges for 70%, 80%, and 80%, 70%, and 60%. This basically is what we did. And so you can see, well, yeah, actually, I forgot on this iteration of the map, we didn't do 100 to 50, we did 95 to 55, so, but basically, so in other words, what I said is if it's equal to 95% of the region average, then it's not eligible for abatement. So that's what this table is telling you. You know, again, it's worth discussion to say what level of strength relative to the region is worthy of abatement. Is it anything that's not as strong as the region? Is it 80% of the region? I don't know. This is sort of what we came up with and wanted to discuss with you guys. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of getting away from the map for a second. This is kind of going back to talking about the financial model for projects over $1 million. Just so you guys know, we haven't made any underlying changes to the model or the analysis. We've sort of cleaned up the aesthetics of it, both on the inputs and the outputs, making it easier for the developers and easier for you guys, hopefully. We've been updating the dashboard and scorecard, which shows on the next.
Jonathan, maybe this is a whole lot of material. Maybe we can kind of.
Do you want to skip this part?
No, let's just stop here for a second and talk about
The map, sure.
the map for a minute, because I think you had 2 decision points in there.
Yeah, you're right. This is kind of getting to another topic, so good call.
Why don't we go ahead, and I believe there's 2 decision points that you want to have, but before we do those, I want to make sure that we understand that the map is for under $1 million, and that's residential and non-residential, or is that just,
So all the data points are residential data points, so it makes the most sense for it to just be residential.
okay, and because I think this is kind of important for everybody to understand. So the map is for under $1 million, typically residential. It's my understanding that your intent is to go ahead and still, if it's employment-related or business-related, then the intent is to break away from the map and
Yeah, we'll use the model still.
use the model if it's going to create jobs or something non-residential. So that's kind of one thing. Another thing I think if I understand this correctly, in the green zone, for smaller projects in the green zone, they're not going to get any abatement for small residential projects. They still will get abatement for projects that would go through the model that are justified by the model.
If they're justified by the model,
And
yeah.
they very well may end up getting 10-year abatement or TIF or something else in those zones if it's still economically beneficial for the city. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can I make a key point here? I want to make sure that everybody understands that the map is not absolute. And so, because we need to be sure that this is a guide, this is what we want people to look at and they get an idea whether it's the possible. But if there are some extenuating circumstances that happens within the all-green area, or something that is in the all-pink, any one of these areas, we need to be able to bring the extenuating circumstance to the table and make an argument for whatever we need. But for the most part, this is the guide, if you will, going in.
And
And the other thing I think I want to make sure is everybody understand that if we say 10 or whatever the year is, it's up to. And so we want to be sure that we can make a value judgment, that it's not automatic that we are there, okay? And the reason that we went to 15 is because we have a whole bunch of low-income housing tax credit projects that we normally get. But I would like not to make that the standard if we don't really need to go 15 years. We prefer to stay at 10 if it makes the return for the investor and for the homeowner work, because it works better for us.
Sure, and that was a point I wanted to make, and I want to go ahead and we want to slow down here, and there's two decision points, if I understand you correctly. One is, and so feel free to ask about anything, but in the back of your mind, be thinking about what they're going to ask us. For the smaller projects, this thing is mostly before the Neighborhood Development Committee, so my inclination is to go ahead and express our opinions, but probably to defer more to the Neighborhood Development Committee for the smaller projects. So the first decision point is how to treat tax abatement for larger, more expensive homes, the whole idea of dealing with social equity so that we're not incentivizing, homes for just wealthy people. And then the second one was the grid that you had before us. Is that correct, the second decision point?
That table? Mm-hmm.
Which is on the screen right now. Okay, so with that, why don't we go ahead and go through the committee? If it's all right, Madam Vice Chair, we'll start off and just go through seniority. Alderman Boyd, do you have any questions or comments on either those two decision points or anything else that's been said so far today?
I just have a comment. First of all, I want to thank SLDC for all the hard work of trying to put this map together. I know it's extremely complicated. I heard it being said that, it's not a perfect map, and it just kind of reminded me of doing ward redistricting. How it just kept moving, and someone said, well, if you change one thing, it moves the map around in other ways. It's just like that, pretty much. But I think it's a good starting point. Again, I appreciate the work that's gone into it thus far. Thank you.
Alderwoman Davis.
I'm going to ditto his comments, but I just needed just a little bit of clarity on a couple of things here. So when we talk about the
Sorry.
areas that are,
Would you mind speaking? I'm
I'm
having
so sorry.
hearing issues, so I can't hear what you're
I
saying.
forgot I had to do that. I'm very much happy that we're getting to some format that everybody can recognize and know where the starting point is. But when we talk about the no abatement area, we still have some parts of this green that needs to be developed. We've still got some large parcels within that area. And so will we look at those in a case by case?
I'll take that. Yeah, I think we'll look at it case by case, as we talked about. We're also looking at sale comps and market data for these cases. And I think the important thing is what the map gives us is like we said, a starting point. If SLDC staff recommendation differs from that starting point, then we will provide an explanation as to why it is. So, and we'll also give you our recommendation and that reasoning, and have that discussion, and then Otis can kind of take it from there too.
Yeah, so our first, if it's in that area, the first response is no. And then we should then look and see, is it a property that has been there for 20 years and nothing has happened? Then we need to probably look and see, would there a small incentive be wise to try and get that done?
Right.
Okay, and so we have to make, as Matt just indicated, if we would have to make that argument to you for the board to do something other than what the map will show.
Okay, and none of this process affects our current approved 353 projects?
It does not change the 353
Right.
piece. That
If I could, Madam Vice Chair, I believe we've had some discussions in anticipation of this map with the 353 holders, at least the ones, Cortex is a 353 holder and now SLU is, with the idea that, we would like and kind of expect them to begin, if the city came up with a citywide plan, that they would try to adhere to it so that they're not undermining what we're trying to do now. I don't know the enforceability of that.
But I think the resolution, I'm not sure, if it may be something that we have to address in the resolution, but for right now, it essentially represent what we, LCRA and PIEA, will abide by, as I understand it.
Yeah, because I noticed that, because there is some housing development that's going to happen inside that, and it would affect it dramatically in us getting it developed.
We would love to have the 353 essentially follow what we are trying to get done here.
Okay, all right. Understand. And my last thing, very quickly, when you were talking about incentivizing investments that are large, and in both of your presentations, all of your presentations, you touched on the base of the competitive part of this with other communities. And so a little bit of this takes us out of the game. And that's one of the reasons why we're suffering as much as we are. Because when people can go to another area and receive all kinds of benefits from living there, and we're not offering any incentives for those to be here, we still lose. So if we're not going to try to make sure that our people stop going out Highway 40 and spending all their money at the Brentwood Plaza and all these places, and try to get some of those stores in the city, and also benefit from the people right across the bridge to come here and spend their money, do we not lose?
Well, first of all, I think most of those types of projects would fall under the financial model. so we would be balancing the financial benefit to the city with the developer. So,
Some are small, though, some are small.
I mean,
but
if
they are-
you're,
Yeah, but they are commercial, so we'd be looking at them from a financial.
But that includes housing as well, though.
I mean, if what you're talking about is like high-income resident housing, I think ultimately what this boils down to is it's a policy and philosophical decision. Obviously, different people
In the wrong people.
decide where they want to live for different reasons. Schools, quality of neighborhood, quality of life, who their neighbors are, what have you. And as Alderman Rohde's presentation talked about, you know, pricing and competition, it is true that basically if there's somebody who's out there who says, I really like living in the city of St. Louis, let's say Soulard or the Central West End, just as much as I like living in Richmond Heights or Clayton or whatever, but the only difference is what I'm going to pay in taxes, then this map will cause us to lose those, probably, right? I think that, and this is where it comes down to philosophy and policy, I think that if that's the difference and that's the reason why we lose them, I think that we've lost them for other reasons that, like, this map probably isn't going to help us with. Like, for example, some of the things that happen, the philosophies that we're trying to preserve with this map are sort of the diversity of incomes, and with diversity of incomes comes diversity of all kinds of diversity of races, diversity of or gender orientation, all sorts of things. And there are a number of people who choose to live in the city of St. Louis for those things more so than they choose to live here for schools or whatever reason people go to live in the county. I don't want to live in the county, but it's just
It's
me.
boring.
You know?
Can I say a little something too?
Yeah, so I guess just basically, if there's people that are, it boils down to price, then you're right. This map could potentially cost us some of those people. I think that there's other people that we could lose if we're not careful about how we deal with, you know, really issues of equity and equality. So.
I think another issue that we've seen is I've been looking at home listings in various areas of the city, trying to compare those with abatement and those without abatement. A lot of those are green areas, and some of them are red areas, like I mentioned. Is you look up a property that received tax incentive, and you look at the listing, and it doesn't even mention tax incentives. And if you talk to realtors, you know, in some of these areas, you know, the home buying more than a lot of other things is an emotional purchase. You know, John and I would get out our calculator and see how much benefit we get from that tax abatement, but the home buyer that sees the stainless steel open kitchen, you know, that tax abatement is worth something to them, but it's probably not the full value. So I think we need to balance those issues, and if we're looking at realtors and realty listings, we want to use those incentives to the maximum effect in the areas that really need them. So, and like I said, I think we're gonna be looking at these closely as well on an individual basis.
Okay, and you did mention that you would look at something above 10 years if you thought it was necessary. And so we'll have that in the resolution as well.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderman Kotar.
No questions.
Alderman Ogilvie.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to say thank you because this is a pretty sophisticated level of analysis, I think, and I think we need to recognize it is light years beyond where we were just a few years ago, where we really had no consistent policy, you know, formally or informally, and all these decisions were basically ad hoc decisions. So for me personally, I think this is very valuable. It's valuable just day to day in terms of doing my job and communicating a clear set of expectations to people who might be building a new home, and some credible information, behind that to say here's why, which I appreciate. I think it's also very valuable just to demonstrate to the broader public, who of course is pretty skeptical of this stuff sometimes, that we are being responsible and deliberate and hopefully fair in how we're considering what types of projects get incentives and which do not. So, I mean, I'm very happy with the outcome of this, and I want to start using it as soon as we possibly can. I do have one question on Mr. Bauer's part of the presentation, the abatement cap portion. The $250,000 number seems like just kind of a number out of a hat. Do we have an idea of, how we might, what the theory is, behind picking a number for the abatement cap? And then, since the appraised value is going to change every couple years, that increment above the abatement cap will change, and people's property taxes will change, and who is going to be calculating that is my question.
So one thing that we looked at was, you're right, the 250 was just a number that we kind of threw out there just to start with. One thing we looked at was just saying 2 times the median home value of the region, which would actually be $265,000 and change. And you could put that into the ordinance. And then obviously that would adjust automatically. Now granted, there's always a 2-year lag on that variable, but I don't know, I guess.
For the increase, I mean, essentially, especially for the assessor's office to compute it, and what I've shown in the graph is essentially it would be it wouldn't be a hard cap. It would be an adjusted percentage based on kind of what I show on that graph. So if it was a 90% abatement, to 90% non-capped abatement, and then we decided to cap it at 250, then essentially it would become like I forgot what it was on the slide, but like a...
Right. Are they going to know to make that, I mean, because right now they're just making, like, if you've got a 90% abatement, they say, okay, here's your assessed value, pay 10% of that. Are they going to know to, like, make this 2-step calculation that changes every...
Well, I don't think it would be a 2-step calculation. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong.
We would calculate it and
Okay.
tell them what the number would be. Yeah, so we would calculate it and tell them in the sort of the resolution what the percentage would be. They wouldn't have to calculate
So it wouldn't
it.
be, it looks like a cap, but essentially we're adjusting the amount based on that cap. Yeah. Did you?
Derek?
Okay, you're adjusting it to okay. So somebody builds a let's just use this example, $350,000 house. That's the initial appraisal. So you're saying, there's $100,000 of value there that you're not going to have tax abatement on. So the sort of total tax abatement is 71%.
Right.
My question was, the $350,000 number changes every 2 years because the property's still being reassessed every 2 years.
Well, I think the idea is it would be fixed at the beginning. The only thing that would be changing is 2 years from now, the amount would be for a new house. I don't think you can change it every 2 years.
Yeah.
It would be a fixed amount once we start the tax abatement, it would be fixed at exactly 71%.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
that's
where the confusion,
my question.
I think where the confusion is coming in is that you're right that it's actually going to be based on what the projected value is going to be based upon completion, and then we're just going to set what the amount would be ahead of time.
Okay.
And so there is, that's something that has to be acknowledged, is that it's going to be based on our best projection of what we think the house is going to be worth when it's all set.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so if I can, let me interject just a second. So I I've had, been hot and cold on this. My whole deal is to make it simple, so that we,
mess it
because if we get to a point where we have to do the math for folk, it gets to be somewhat problematic. This slide was generated based on discussion with the aldermen during our 4 sessions. And so that was some idea, some thought to try and do that. So we did it. But me personally, my preference is that it's simple and that we just, I think we're making a great impact by taking away from instead of doing 100%, we're now into areas where we're doing 80 and 75 and, depending upon on the initiative. That's simpler for us. Okay, but there's also the thought that we would have greater savings if we did have a cap. And so that's something that you all need to decide, but understanding that's a level of complexity that not only is in our shop, but also the assessor's shop.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about, how that complexity would be worked through. I mean, the other similar type of idea is to just set a cap, and if the per unit value is over some amount, you don't get any tax abatement. So that, I mean, the idea is we're not incentivizing properties that are just sort of luxury properties. If we do end up with, a threshold number, I personally think 250,000 is probably too low, just because the median value might be, 130 or 40 or whatever in the region, but the new property value is always higher because you have all these development costs of acquisition and demolition, and you're starting out on every new project with at least $50,000 generally in acquisition and demolition, and you can't build a new home with no incentive that is a median value home in the city. So, so 250 seems low, but overall, I mean, let's get this over the finish line and and
Just to clarify, though,
get it out.
the 250 was the actual development cost of the new house. It did not include demolition. It did not include the acquisition.
Well, we've got 3 options.
With that, but when we really talked about 250, that's what we were focusing on, not, because you're right. I mean, those are above and beyond factors.
Okay. Well, we'll figure that out, but let's figure it out soon. Thank you, guys.
Alderwoman Boyd.
No questions.
Alderman Bosley.
Good morning. Seeing, really appreciate the work you all are putting in. I have, I guess more so, I just want to clarify some things and make a statement at the same time. What I want to clarify is this 10 years, is that what we're capping everything at? Like we're not trying to go over 10 years as far as for tax abatement?
So you're talking about like in the red zone there?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so the way it's written is a little confusing. It's 15 years, but the first 10 is at 95%, and then the next 5 is at 50.
Oh, that has to be much clearer for all of us,
Yeah.
especially the public.
What was it?
So it's 15 years, 10 at 90% and 5 at 50%.
Yeah, we can,
Instead of
I'm
a
sorry,
slash, we could
95%.
probably just put a plus there.
yeah.
Put a plus.
15, yeah.
Okay.
We can clarify
But it
that.
didn't look like that.
Okay. Well, that was a big part of the question. My ward is, I would say we have the lowest median income in the entire city. So with that, I mean, of course, we need all the incentives we can get. It's not like we got a plethora of people that are pouring into the neighborhood trying to build. But at some point in time, when that does happen, a lot of times I think what isn't being done is we're incentivizing developers, and we're not making sure we're incentivizing the people that actually live in the neighborhood so they can have what they need to be able to live there when the development actually comes. Like right now, we got the NGA, half the people that lived around it are gone, which I appreciate the project, but when you talk about all the development that could possibly spur from that one large project, there aren't many initiatives focused on making sure that those residents are retained. There are initiatives to build new housing, initiatives to build new businesses, initiatives to bring in as much development as possible. Of course, we want to raise we want to bring more into general revenue, but at the same time, if we have people that live in these areas who've been here for 40 years moving out when other people are moving in because we haven't given them anything to say, you know, I can afford to live here in 10 years. Most of the people in that area are afraid that at some point in time taxes will go up so high that they won't be able to afford to live within the area. And that is very possible. It's not to say it's going to happen overnight, but in 10 to 15 years, a lot of things could happen. So if those people who live in the area, which is not a very highly populated area, I have the second geographically largest ward in the city. So it takes a while for us to get to 11,000 residents, and most of those individuals aren't homeowners also. We have about 60% renters within the ward also. So with that, my job is to retain the individuals who live in the neighborhood because those are the people who voted to bring up the quality of life, for me to try to bring up the quality of life for them. So I want to make sure that within this, that I can help the people who actually live in the neighborhood and incentivize them opposed to the developers, because in my area, I know they're coming one way or another. A lot of places in the city are already built, just like we, I don't know, I forgot who just said it, but IKEA, isn't coming to the north side anytime soon. So the residents that live there are telling family members, hey, you need to come move here. And the people that live in the neighborhood have a idea that at some point in time it'll come up. So I think there needs to be a plan for those residents. I think because we have the lowest median income in the city, I think it's a little hard to speculate on if people will be able to afford to live in the area in 5 or 10 years. You can try to get people prepared for what they could potentially be paying in taxes, but we really don't know. So, well, let me not say we don't know. I'll say that there, once again, isn't any initiatives that I know of to make sure that that is something that's being watched like we're paying attention to incentives right now. So I think in an area where we have extremely low median income, where it's the lowest in the city, I would like any tax abatement that comes for the residents in that area to be 100%, because we've done 100% on multiple occasions. So, we're talking individuals who can afford an extra $100, an extra $150 or $200 in 2 years from now, if they do have a project like IKEA coming. Those people that live right across the street from the NGA, you got Paul McKee that wants to build a gas station right on Cass and Jefferson. You got houses that are right down the street from there. He's tried acquiring their properties. Of course, you have other but banks that want to acquire their properties. People are trying to buy them out every day. I speak to them on a regular basis. They are always thinking about selling because, they're upside down on most of their home loans. They, got $50,000 into the house and the house is only worth $30,000. When we know in another 4 to 10 years it could be worth a lot. We're talking 3,000 square foot houses that are all brick, so they could easily be worth $250,000. So they should be abated at 100% when they get the funds to start putting in to their actual houses, so they can afford to live here in the next 10 years, and we can plan for them to be able to afford to live in the area, because just because the area is going up doesn't mean your income doesn't mean that you have the tools necessary to be able to bring in more income just because you live in a more stable environment. So I most certainly think that's something that we need to look into. I think 10 years, honestly, in the lowest part of the city isn't enough time to change a mindset, because that's one of the things that need to be changed. Just because you grow up, and just because the area is coming up around you, right? Once again, doesn't mean that the mindset is being changed. Doesn't mean that people are getting better jobs. Just because better jobs are available, that does not mean, once again, these people are going to secure those better jobs. We only have construction jobs available for like the next 6 years across, over there at the site. And of course, more things could come with more development. But speaking in terms of what we actually have that are tangible right now, I just think we need to be making sure that we're looking at individuals who actually live within the city, because our population is dwindling repeatedly. Every time we look at the census, we're losing people by the tens of thousands. So I want to work on retention at the same time while we're incentivizing people who don't live in the area to come and build. So I would like that, that 10 years, just, I don't know, how we need to do that. I don't know if we can maybe make maybe a purple section or something, where it's a little bit lower, but I think that's something that needs to be looked at, because if not, it doesn't matter how much work we put in this, none of the people who live around development as it sparks will be there to tell the story of how the ward used to be, or how this area used to be, how it used to be plagued with certain things, and to where it is kind of right now, or where it will be after we incentivize. So definitely wanted to put that out there.
So I just want to respond by saying that we will be looking at, in our economic development strategy plan, how we can, look at issues that you've identified. But as we talk with the citizens as we're developing this plan, we're going to identify a lot of things, and we hope to come up with strategies to try to ensure that we have a very inclusive plan going forward that will help citizens as we move forward as well. So I hear you on everything that you said. I just want to make sure everybody on the panel understand there are a couple of key words that are on here, up to. And so if you see that line that says up to, it doesn't mean just because that color is there that we will do, that it's going to be automatic, that is the number that is going to be there. In most cases, it will be, just because of the area that we're talking about, the conditions that you define. But there may be other areas here where we have a street, if we look at it, because many of us can drive to areas that are in the pink or orange here, and we can find things that are going very well. But most of it is not. And so, but we got to be able to take in consideration the places where things are going well. Because this is built on the blocks, that means that we have a very wide area, and so within the city block dimension, you can have varying conditions that may occur, and so which is why we wanted to be sure that we had that latitude. So I just want to be sure everybody understands that.
Understood. From what I see, with all due respect, it kind of looks like that you all have already kind of done it. Of course, you might have, like you said, it could be a house across the street that needs a little bit of work. It could be, vacant for 20 years and everything else is built up in the neighborhood. When you live in nothing and around nothing but decay, no matter if you go one block up and that block is solid, but the next 4 blocks are not, everything needs to be incentivized, period, point blank. And every single block has an effect on the other one, because you have to walk past this, you have to drive by this. When you type in an address on Google, it doesn't talk to you about the surrounding blocks, it talks to you about the surrounding area. So when people are typing in somewhere to live, they're looking at the schools. The school is not up the street or up the block. It might be a mile away, but that's within the general area. And you look at all of those things to decide where or where not you do not want your children, and where you were not you do not want to raise a family. So a lot of people that live in these neighborhoods will tell you, even if their block is solid, I heard a gunshot 4 blocks away. So those things are the whole area itself, I think, needs to be looked at, and all of our areas, well, let me not go that far into it. I'm just going to say my area in particular, because I haven't went through every single person's ward to be able to say exactly what it is that they need. I know particularly at the lowest level of income in the city, we need as much as possible. I'm working with some developers right now who want to build $250,000 houses. I don't want them to put $1 million or $2 million into building different projects and not be able to get the incentives that they got in the Shaw neighborhood, on Tower Grove just 5 years ago. We haven't had any interest in people wanting to build those type of houses in a while. Some people didn't want them. I would like to have mixed housing incomes. I don't have a problem, well, let me not say I don't have a problem with gentrification. I don't have a problem with the income levels changing. I don't have a problem with having mixed incomes. You know, black people have hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's white people out here with hundreds of thousands of dollars. It all comes down to how you're advertising your neighborhood. So that's definitely something that I also want to look at. I think $250,000, once again, when you bring in that much money into a neighborhood where you got $250,000 houses, but they're only valued at $30,000, and you want to build up from the ground, those things need to be incentivized. Those people need to have a clear mind on, you know, if I spend all the time designing this, if I spend all the time putting in the work, you know, can you, on your end, which is my end, being an alder person, give me what I need to make sure this project can make sense for me, you know, in the long run. So those are things I most certainly think need to be addressed also. Once again, the city is one of the weirdest cities I think around. I've done my fair share of travel. I'm sure you all have too. The whole city is gerrymandered. Like, when it comes down to the way we think, when it comes down to where we live, lifestyles, different teachings, incomes, it's weird. And, you know, because of that, I think the map needs to kind of reflect that at the same time. Not saying that it isn't, but there are certain things I think, once again, that we need to pay attention to, especially in those very, very low ends. At some point in time, when we do get people coming in, which I think will happen in the very near future, there needs to be peace of mind for the people that live there. So.
And I do think it's important to say that, you know, with the recommendations and the map, we would still be consulting with you as part of that process.
So hypothetically speaking, if I ran into a resident, let's say they ran into some money, you know, and they wanted to put $250,000 into their house, right? They've never had the amount of funds to do so. Could I, in this red zone, incentivize them and give them 100 years tax abatement for 15 years?
Wait, 100%?
Yeah, I'm sorry, 100% for 15 years.
Otis can speak to that too, but as the map is now, it's 95 and 5, but you...
So our goal, I understand what you're saying, but our goal has been to try and get a little bit of the tax to flow through to the taxing districts. And so obviously the legislation is introduced by each of you, and so you know, we generally, our recommendation probably will be 95, but your ability to introduce whatever you desire would be.
And I do think I calculated the difference between that 5% on a 30-year mortgage, and I think it was like $15 a month. I'd have to go back and do it again, but I remember somebody else asked a similar question, and I went through the calculations on, like, I think it was like $250,000. Or no, I think it was per $100,000. It was like, and I could get back with you on that amount. No. I can get back with you on that amount, but I calculated per $100,000 what the difference of that 5% is, and I think it was like $15 a month. So, just so you have a scale of what that 5% does.
Understood. And just to say, you know, $200-300 for some people is a lot of money at the end of the year. When you're used to paying a certain amount, most of the people in my area are seniors. They're on fixed income. I speak with them on a regular. Everybody's afraid, and that's just, you know, just want to.
Well,
put that out there.
I guess what I would end with is that this is our bogey, and we take your advice as you guys would like to modify. But this is what we're recommending, okay?
Okay, so if this resolution was to pass today, once again, the question is, would I not, or would I be able to give that person 10-year tax abatement, 15 years at 100%, in its current form?
No.
No.
Okay, that's it. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question real quick?
The alderman from the 16th will
Sure.
yield.
The state law limits the years 11 to 15 to 50%, right? Isn't that?
I don't think so.
Or is that? That's why I asked. I wasn't.
That has been our thought for a long time, but the attorneys have taken, it's worded in such a way that it's very confusing, but I think the latest thought of attorneys is, yes, it can be up to 100%, even for the latter years.
Okay, well, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
We could potentially create another zone, like even below a certain threshold. Again, like that's part of the policy decision, you know. Like right now, it's anything below 50, but we could say if it's below 40, whatever, you know.
And again, most of these projects will not be before our committee. Most projects of this scale will actually be before the Neighborhood Development Committee. Trying to figure out the best way. I want to make sure that you understand that we are listening. I'm thinking that we shared that with you, with these gentlemen. Hopefully they will share it with neighborhood development. I think we want to have their impact on that issue. On the other issue, I want to make sure you realize that we are trying to listen to you and we want to be respectful of you as a member of our committee. My goal is if we can get through the tax abatement this discussion here, kind of put that aside, next week for a year, and they do the economic development plan and stuff. Then I'm actually meeting with Gerard on Friday. I was going to ask the alderman from the 16th to join us. We're going to start getting back to do some of our performance measures. But I was going to ask him to begin leading us briefly on community benefit agreements and then flow right into some of the affordable housing stuff. And I believe part of the issue, I think there's two issues as I understood your comments. The first issue is the impact of growing property values on your indigenous, the folks who are up there today. And there are, I think, some things that many people can become educated about, things like circuit breakers for those who are living on fixed incomes. I think, as a city, I'm not there yet. I think we want to get some data, but, being able to afford more revolving loan programs and things like that might be of some help. We're working with Alana Green in CDA, and she has commissioned a group to come in and help us go through all of our affordable housing programs and try to get a single report that will collect data from all of these things so that we can kind of have a holistic view of that. But that is an issue that I've dealt with in my neighborhoods as the areas become better. I know the alderman from the 19th has dealt with it over in the Botanical Heights, which is a neighborhood that we share, and Tiffany. So I think it's a really valid concern. I think that it would help for all of us to understand that, and my hope is to have Gerard help us lead that conversation. But we need to kind of get with get this incentive stuff behind us first. The second issue I think you were talking about is can we even do more incentives for than what's on here for the really distressed areas? And I think my response to that would be is most of those decisions are going to be made in the Neighborhood Development Committee. So I would encourage that we, bring that up. I mean, that was one of the discussion points, so you're right on target with that comment. And
May I add one more
Sure.
comment in response to Alderman Bosley? So this is it's just my thoughts on things, and this is not specifically related to abatement or to the map, but it has to do with how do we bring wealth and investment back into areas like yours. So Otis mentioned the strategic plan and the types of things that we're going to be looking at in the plan. One of the things in the plan is we're going to be looking at industry clusters. Well, a lot of plans look at industry clusters at a region-wide level, and they're going to look at things like finance and biotech and tech jobs or whatever. And generally those are not the types of jobs that people that are lower income that are living in your ward are going to be able to get. So one of the things that we're really focusing on and talking to the consultants is how do we identify the clusters that are sort of blue collar clusters, the clusters that that people can get if maybe they only have a technical 2 years of college, or maybe even only a high school degree, right? There are a number of those types of jobs, even jobs that are maybe touch on or tangential to some of these bigger clusters like biotech, such as people who go to the labs and have to clean them out and prep them for the next day. Those are decent paying jobs that you don't have to have a 4-year degree for or whatever to be able to get. And we can try and attract those companies to those types of neighborhoods. Now the thing that I want to add is, and this is what other cities do, and this is what I hope that someday we can get to, although there are budgetary restrictions, to really, once you have the plan, if it's going to actually be implemented in neighborhoods like yours, the ones that are really struggling, what we, in my opinion, we need essentially an economic development director, a deal maker for every portion of the city like that. Someone who goes in and says, these are the sites we can acquire, we can put together, these are the businesses we can go after, these are the places where we can make sure that we have set aside for affordable housing. I mean, it's very involved, and it's a fairly high-level skill set, and therefore you have to pay for it, which we don't have budget for, like I said, and it's just my opinion, so Otis is probably going to tell me.
Yeah,
Grab the hook and the mic.
Yeah, I'm grabbing the plug in the
I
mic.
saw that coming.
So disregard everything he said before.
Yeah.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more thing real quick.
Let me provide the alderman from the 16th.
Oh, that's right, okay, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Alderman.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. First of all, this is a very thoughtful analysis, so thank you for putting it together. I just want to make sure I had something clear. For projects over $1 million, as well as commercial or economic development deals, including jobs or employment, those will run through the financial analysis model separately
Okay,
from
yeah.
this map. Right, so those projects will still be receiving the level of analysis and scrutiny from you all, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Projects that are within this, I want to just touch on one thing, and maybe in the form of advice, and I know you know this, but to the extent that this becomes sort of a policy, which is good, and a policy is a guideline, knowing that there will need to be exceptions sometimes made to these, I think where the public and maybe us as elected officials can get frustrated sometimes is where it feels like exceptions become the policy. So that we're adhering to, this is a map, and exceptions are just that, exceptions, and that we really try to stay true to this as a policy and a matter of making sort of equitable decision-making.
Yeah, and what I'd say too is, I think now we have something to answer to, so if there is
Correct.
an exception, there might be the obvious ones, the affordable housing, the historic, there might be some others, but at least we have the map to answer to. So the map said 5 years at 50%, we think it's, what's the next level up? We think it's 5 years at 90%. Here's the, but here's the reason.
Yep.
Before, we didn't even have to answer to a guideline, so we didn't have to provide that rationale. And I think, and that rationale will go to you, and then it'll go to the LCRA board. It'll come to, in most cases, neighborhoods, and then the board.
Yep.
And we'll have to, and then the question will arise: why are you deviating from the map? And we will have to have an answer for that.
Okay. Good answer. Thank you. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Alderman from the 19th, you had said you had another.
Oh, I just wanted to share a couple of things because I feel the pain of the alderman from the 3rd Ward. Actually, the 19th Ward was worse than the 3rd Ward when Mac McMillan started off. So understand that it's going to take a moment, and there are a lot of tools that you're going to need. And technically, projects under $1 million are not going to help you that much anyway. It would take you 50 years to turn the ward around. So you're really going to be looking at larger projects and stabilization. Those are the two things that have to work together. So the people that are living there, they need stabilized opportunities. And that, I think that's what our gentleman was talking about. And I don't think it necessarily will come from us, the city. I think it will come from other agencies and other entities that want to see that part of the community turned around. And it's a part of who you are, which you do very well, and that's selling your community. So they got to feel the leadership, and you sell the community, and that way you'll have those people who want to come in and invest their money because they feel good about working with you. You have and the first thing to do is clean the neighborhood up. You know, you and I talked about this. So know that there are a lot of resources out here, but you got to bring them so that the people can feel good about it. And I also wanted to recognize Bobby Gissendan is sitting out there, who is a guru. When you talk about development, that is a guru. And back in the day, when we had all those programs operating at the same time, under the first resurgence of the city of St. Louis, starting in the late 70s and moving forward, he was a part of all of that. And he has stayed a part of development in the background. And so that might be somebody you want to talk to. Okay, then you're smart. You're even smarter than I realized. You know, your facade improvement programs, we can allocate some of that in block grant, because people have to feel comfortable. So if their house not looking right, they don't feel good about that, okay? So those are the kinds of things that we have to do, and it really doesn't cost a lot. The home repair program is one thing, but it's income limits to that. And so you got to strategize a lot of different things and use all those resources out there. I'm excited about it, and like I said, this really doesn't pertain to us. It really does.
Okay, we have, why don't we continue to move on here? We still have the model to go through, so why don't we pick up where we left off, and
It's quick.
we're going to probably give everybody one more shot at questions after the model then, so.
Yeah, this is just a couple slides, I think. Basically, we just said that we didn't actually change the model itself. We're trying to make the output forms a little bit easier. We created the white paper, which was passed out in our meetings, I believe, with the aldermen who came. But we can get that to anybody else who wants to see it. You know, again, the basic goals of the model are to make sure that we establish a but-for, so making sure that the developer has a reasonable return but not an excessive return, and then also to make sure that it meets the financial goals of the city, that is profitable to the city. And that's basically what the white paper explains. But we're also putting our application online, and so therefore all data will start to be captured in a database. Ultimately, we'll have dashboards, hopefully very soon. Well, we'll have to go back and put in a bunch of old data before the dashboards will tell us anything meaningful, but we'll have dashboards that I think we'll be able to make available publicly. I got to check with the software maker, but to see how to do that. But anyway, but the goal is to be able to, if we can't, the goal will be to either put it directly so people can search it themselves, or to make it so either we have to make PDFs of it and then put it online or whatever. But and then we're obviously looking to listen to any ways that we can improve the existing model. We can go to the next slide. This is sort of an example of how we're sort of trying to change the output form to sort of make the metrics a little bit easier for you guys to understand. You guys will see this more in depth as we start presenting projects. You'll notice the star rating system is not on there. We still calculate it, but for our benefit more than anything, so we can sort of use that as we talk to you. But yeah, just trying to make it clear, this is how much revenue is coming in, this is what the average revenue would be for a similar project in this neighborhood, this is what the revenue target would be, and so you guys can just see those numbers and just kind of make a decision, kind of like we do, kind of like what the scorecard, what the score was doing was taking all that information and then just processing it for you guys. So now you can just see what the score was doing and kind of do it, with our recommendation. We'll guide you through that. But anyway, we'll go to the next slide. I think this is the last one, maybe. Matt, can you remind me what this one was?
This is just updating kind of some things we're doing in the process, not the map or the model, but we're starting to be more regular about after the LCRA prep meeting, we make our recommendations, go back to the aldermen so that there's no surprises, and then we can have any further discussions we need if a recommendation did not meet your expectation. On the LCRA board, previously, if we ended up not recommending abatement for a project, it just didn't make the agenda. Now it's on the agenda in the minutes, so that we're highlighting those cases where abatement was not awarded because it was not needed. We're also going to start trying to do some building permit reporting. So looking at building permits that come through on a monthly basis and look at, which ones are abated, which ones are affordable, which ones we haven't had a lot of TIFs lately, so that's not really, but also be able to do some types of reporting on that, and based on the type of program or incentive they're getting by ward. So that's something that we've just started, but we're looking at getting some more data from that. And then also, some of these things came through our interactions with you in the meetings. So if there's other ideas, we're open to those. And I think that might have been the last slide. Is there another one? That's it. Thank you. Thanks for your time. And we're available to answer any questions about that last section.
So there's no changes to the underlying model, which means that the model has recommended some projects that have been somewhat controversial within the last, including like the 100 up on Kings Highway. So if the 100 came in today, it would still probably pass the model history, although we might have the $250,000 cap on it. For everybody's information, that was
$250,000 per unit.
Yeah, per unit.
Value.
That was what, 275 is what you guys calculated, so that there might have been some constriction from that, but that project would still have, it would probably.
And I think the dashboard we showed, we got into a little bit more detail in some of the smaller meetings, would, I think, better illustrate why that project got incentive. Because when you look at it compared to the neighborhood average multifamily development, even with the incentive in place, it was well outperforming the neighborhood average, largely due to its density and the high rents it charged and the types of tenants it brought in.
By the way, the average value per unit on that project was $275,000, just as an FYI.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you just say that?
Yeah.
Oh. My hearing's terrible.
The thing that I'm particularly, when we start analyzing and tracking these things, then we start getting a trend and we can actually see how we're doing. And this building permit reporting thing, which I've talked to Matt a fair amount about, and I think that was actually called out in the original Resolution 33A. I'm having trouble finding it here in this one. But I think the goal was to actually have that up and running by September in the original resolution, which this is September. So I would hope that we can work to get that so it's coordinated with the GASB, the GASB requirements, so that we can actually start tracking that, ideally monthly, so we can really start demonstrating that to the public and everybody else, so that we can actually start seeing some trend lines as far as the percentage of value to the total project cost, and start looking at that in a whole bunch of different ways. I think we'll learn a lot from that. Are there any other questions? Alderman Boyd, did you have any comments about the model or anything else today?
I just have a quick tax abatement question. So a school or a nonprofit, are they totally exempt, or is it only for educational purposes or their place of doing business? How does that work with the nonprofits?
It's not based on the ownership of the property, but rather the use of the property. So if they're using the property for a nonprofit purpose, then they become tax exempt. But if they own the property but rent it out to a grocery store, they're not tax exempt.
For example, so a university that builds student housing.
I think if it's strictly, you're getting in maybe a gray area, but no, I think if it's strictly student housing, then it's tax exempt. Because it's definitely for a university purpose. But if they're going to rent it out to the general public, then I mean, that's probably a question you need to ask someone other than me that's really an expert in that field.
You're actually saying it right.
Wait a minute, Dale, you only been here 50 years.
That's true. That's true.
And you're going to tell me I have to ask an expert?
Yes, ask an expert, a tax expert.
But it
or
goes-
really the assessor's office, probably.
Okay, I'll ask the
Yeah,
assessor's
Gerard may
office.
know.
I
Okay,
think Gerard knows. Me
All
and
right,
Gerard
thank
have
you.
talked about this quite a bit, but I think Gerard knows. I think it has to do with if the university owns it and how they use it and whether or not they lease it out. It gets complicated, but like if you're talking about St. Louis University camp stuff that's on their campus, I believe that is all going to be tax exempt.
so here's the challenge I have with it, and maybe someone's talked about this years ago, but so the student housing is not free. Student housing they pay for it. It's part of, you have tuition, you have housing, you have all this other stuff. So the university makes money off of it because a student could choose to live off campus, right? And then that property owner would pay taxes on that particular real estate. I just think it's worth looking into because I think about nonprofits that are here doing housing and they're there for the betterment of the community, and maybe they own a 20-unit apartment building, but their whole mission is to give back to the community. But I don't think that 20-unit apartment building would qualify for a tax abatement, would it?
So this might be a relevant example.
Firsthand, dormitories would not pay taxes. Universities do not pay taxes on dormitories.
Where?
But as an example, Washington University just built some apartments or redid the old Shriners Hospital up on the periphery of Forest Park up there in the CID. That was done through a for-profit subsidiary, and it would be a taxable property then because they're renting that out not only to students but other non-students as well. So those are bona fide apartments.
Okay. Well, I guess that makes it a little more clear. I'm not saying it's fair, though.
You can have a long conversation with Gerard about this issue.
There,
like John and I did a
this
couple
is
days
actually
ago.
a hot topic a couple years ago in the suburbs where they had some non-for-profit senior housing that was extremely high-end, and they were owned by, I guess, religious organizations, was that, and they were completely tax exempt. So in other words, they were providing very high-end housing, renting it out to seniors who were very affluent, and they weren't paying any real estate taxes because it was owned by a non-for-profit. So. Yeah, so I know it was controversial. I can't recall how it was. Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
Alderwoman Davis.
I'm good, thank you, no questions.
Alderman Kotar.
No questions.
Alderman Ogilvy.
Just very briefly, some of that dashboard stuff, like the permit activity and dividing it up by, abated, tax exempt, paying full tax, when do we think that'll be up?
I don't know. I've just started working on it, and I need to get a process in place to do it on a monthly basis. So hopefully a couple months, but I'm not. It's a work in progress.
And then Mr. Ferry mentioned putting existing data in it from previous years. And how many years would you expect to do that for?
I didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry.
My bad. Loading prior data into that dashboard you mentioned, how many years back would you expect?
I'll go back as far as I've done projects, so I started basically at the end of 2015.
So 3 or 4 years of data? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that dashboard would actually be really interesting over the long haul. I mean, there's going to be variations year to year, but if you look, if we look over 10 or 20 years and see what portion of permits are paying full freight, that's going to be valuable data for my kids to have.
Actually, the permit, I mean, depending on how efficient we get with it, the permit data is from the building division. That's not reliant on, that's separate from the model. It's two separate things.
Yeah, I understand.
So the building permit info is kind of dependent on what we can get from the assessor and what we can get from the building division, so could potentially go back further.
Good luck
if
with
the
that,
data's,
yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
That wasn't a knock on anybody, I just meant, I'll be interested to see it. Thank you.
Alderman Bosley, any questions?
No, sir, thank you.
Did I jump over Alderman Kotar?
No, you.
Okay. Alderman Oldenburg. Oh, he stepped out. Okay, I think we've been through everything. There was other older people here earlier. I guess we ran them
I know
off.
Pam had to leave.
It was not our intent to vote today, but we wanted to give everybody a preview of this. Our goal is to vote next week. We hope that, I believe the alderman who chairs neighborhood development is out of the country, and so we're hoping that he can, have you been in communication with Alderman Cohn?
I have not, no.
Okay.
But I will say that, the resolution is there in draft form, and any tweaking or information you have over the next few days would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And if nothing else, we'll adjourn for today. Thank you.
Thank you.